Hi, I'm Willa Huston. I'm a senior lecturer and a research group leader at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia.
What is your research focus?
So my research is looking at chlamydia and other infectious diseases and how they lead to infertility in women. So we're really interested in trying to understand what happens in those women that develop infertility and what we could do better to either prevent or treat the chlamydia at that time so they don't go on to progress to developing infertility. So we look at treatment and better diagnosis.
What is actually chlamydia?
Chlamydia is a unique little bacteria. So it's a microscopic organism, and we all know about microbes now. They're everywhere around us, and we hear about them being part of our body. Chlamydia is a bit more special because chlamydia actually lives inside our own cells. So it's a bacteria, but it's like a virus in that it takes over our own cells. And the only place that the chlamydia that infects humans lives is in humans.
If I look up what Wikipedia says, for example, chlamydia is a sexually transmitted infection caused by the bacterium chlamydia, and most people who are infected have no symptoms. The infection can spread to the upper genital tract in women, causing pelvic inflammatory disease, which may result in future infertility or ectopic pregnancy.
This is our cell culture facility here at UTS. This is where we grow chlamydia, and it's a fully contained room, and we use human cells. And here's an incubator, and I'll show you some cells in flasks where we work on our chlamydia cell culture experiments. So in here you can see a whole lot of flasks growing chlamydia. At the moment the lab's pretty busy working on some new molecules that might be good new antibiotics against chlamydia, and we're working on some new models of human disease, including some patient samples that we're working on from women with different forms of disease. So it's an exciting time here in Australia for chlamydia research.
Not everyone who is infected reacts in the same way and gets complications. Why?
It's really interesting. So it's transmitted sexually throughout the population. So it's lots of people know about it as a sexually transmitted infection. And in fact, our research is trying to understand how it is that in some women, this very severe pathology that leads to infertility develops. And so we look at those women, we look at the organism in lab models, and we think that what happens is a combination of what's happening in the woman's body at the time she gets the infection and what are the stages of her cycle and the other organisms there, that all of that comes together so that in some unlucky women, they go on to develop infertility. But that's about as much as we know at the moment. Unfortunately, we need to know a lot more. But one of the things we're trying to do is understand the form of the organism during that infertility development and develop better drug treatments to treat that form. And so that's a high priority for us, is treatment early to prevent the infertility developing.
How many women are affected by infertility?
That is very hard to put a number on, and some studies say as high as 20%. I don't think it's that high, but it's certainly the more infections, there is severe increase in risk. I think the risk is about 1 to 5% of infections will develop infertility, at least in one tube. But given that, so for example, in Australia, there's about 80,000 infections, slightly over half of those are in women. And if you think even if it's only 1%, that's still, annually, that's still significant numbers each year of women who will have tubal infertility that they won't know about.
How about men?
There's lots of evidence that they also get infertility, or at least, reduced fertility from the infections. No doubt we think similar scarring occurs up in the fine tubes in the male reproductive tract, and they're pretty good transmitters. So they're often asymptomatic. They're less likely to seek treatment and testing, and they're very good at transmitting the infection because they often have a good infectious burden. And because of the nature of sex, I guess, they're good transmitters. So they have a big role to play. A, they can be compromised in their own fertility, but B, as key people in the networks that we need to kind of get in for testing and treatment who are not as engaged in their healthcare, it's very important that we look at men.
What do we know about chlamydia and what do we not know about it?
So we know that it's an ancient organism. There's evidence of trachoma, the eye infecting version, in hieroglyphics. So from ancient Egypt. But we even know from genome sequencing analysis that it's a very ancient organism. So it's been around as long as we have. And so we know, therefore, that it's very clever at living inside us. It's almost evolved with us in some ways. And so we do know that it's really clever and that it's really well adapted to live inside our cells. What we don't know is why that goes wrong in some women. So logically, if you only live in humans, you don't want to stop them having sex and transmitting on the organism. And so one hypothesis is that it actually is advantageous for some proportion of women to be infertile or lower fertility with chlamydia, because then they might have more sex in an evolutionary history and the organism could be transmitted. As long as it's not causing very many symptoms, which often it doesn't cause many symptoms, then there's, the women are not prevented from having sexual contact, but they're prevented from having babies, so they're more likely to have more sex. So maybe it's just evolved this feature to increase its spread in the population, but we actually don't know if that's what's happening or it's something about the women themselves, that their particular type of immune response, perhaps their genetic makeup, maybe those are the factors that they've got the unlucky lottery that when they get the chlamydia infection, they're the ones that are going to develop the infertility. So that's one of our unknowns that is a big priority, is that kind of personalized or precision medicine and chlamydia, is it really about that?
Are there differences between countries in the infection rates?
Absolutely. It's a very high burden in the Pacific Rim. So very poor countries like Samoa have very high burden of chlamydia, mostly because there's very little health intervention and very little treatment and testing. In most developed, well-to-do countries like in Europe or Australia or the US, the baseline prevalence, so the average number of people who might have it in reproductively aged individuals, is about 4 to 6%. But even in those countries, marginalised peoples or peoples who have lower socioeconomic conditions have a much higher percent. So it's a disease of marginalised populations. For example, in Australia, you may be aware that we have a First Peoples, the Indigenous people of Australia. They're very marginalised and they're very socioeconomically disadvantaged. And in young people, young Indigenous people, chlamydia can be as high as 24%. So that's really, really high. And so we really worry about the burden of infertility and, other sequelae from chlamydia, like ectopic pregnancy in those young Indigenous people. It's worth mentioning that the other form of chlamydia that infects eyes and can lead to blindness, there's about 5 million people worldwide who are blind from chlamydia trachoma. And again, to our national shame, the Indigenous people of Australia are one of the few peoples in a developed country where we still have trachoma.
Are the chlamydia infections of the eyes and of the genital related?
They're very related, so they're quite similar. There's just a few subtle differences between the eye and the genital infecting chlamydia. So that's in Australia, in fact, it may be that those eye infecting strains may have come from genital strains that came in with Caucasian people when Caucasian people came to the Australian continent just over 200 years ago.
And chlamydia does not affect only humans, but also animals with severe consequences, right?
This is a really, it's an important topic for animals worldwide, but it's a very dear topic to Australians because our national icon, the koala, is suffering severely from chlamydia. The chlamydia that infects the koala is called Chlamydia pecorum. It's a different species from the chlamydia that infects humans, but the disease presents almost identically. So they get ocular infections all around their eye that can lead to blindness, very severe blindness. They get urogenital infections in their urinary and genital tracts, which can lead to incontinence, which we call wet bottom, and it's really debilitating. They're in a lot of pain. Their whole bottom rump is covered in sort of wee, basically, that isn't evacuating properly, and that's from scarring that also scars all through their reproductive tract. That scarring in their eyes and in their reproductive tract looks exactly like what happens in humans. So it's a different chlamydia, but presents in the animals in the same way. And it's a really sad story. In the koala, it's very hard to treat because we can't give them oral antibiotics very often for koalas. Most of the time we can't because they have a special complex gut composition that they really need to because they eat gum leaves. And so what part of our research is actually translated from a human into the koala because we need to find new ways to treat chlamydia in the koala. At the moment, it's one of the major threats to the koala. Habitat loss is the major threat, undoubtedly, and that's a real problem. But as soon as we do more habitat loss and the koala populations get more stressed, the disease increases. So it's a disease like our marginalised people. Chlamydia in the koalas is associated with stresses, and then we already put them under stress from removing more trees or whatever we do, and then the chlamydia presents and then they lose fertility. So the koala is a threatened species right now, so it's not on the extinction list, but it is severely threatened and vulnerable in some states and threatened in others. So, yeah.
But chlamydia in men and women is treatable, correct?
So in humans, we can treat chlamydia, and it's very simple. It's a simple antibiotic regimen, and it's mostly effective if the people stick to the antibiotics and take them. The problem is that because it's often a quiet infection, so it's often asymptomatic, people might not seek treatment. And so the problem is that they often don't get treatment, and then the symptoms develop, or the infertility develops sometimes without them being aware. So treatment's easy, testing is easy. We can do a PCR from a urine sample or a swab, but it's getting the right people into the clinic and getting them tested and treated in time is the problem.
What new information have you learned during your research?
I knew very little when I started, just about 10, 12 years ago now. I thought chlamydia was fascinating in a very abstract way, and I've always loved microbes, but chlamydia was kind of interesting. Now I guess I've learnt that even though it's on face value a very simple microbe compared to most other microbes, it's an amazingly versatile and niche adapted organism that we're really only just beginning to understand. And I think that it's much more versatile and adaptive than we thought. And I think that we also are starting to understand that perhaps it lives in more spots than just the urogenital tract. Perhaps it lives in our gastrointestinal tract. Perhaps it survives longer than we think after treatment. There's a lot of things that we used to think were simple, but they're not. And I think that's the most exciting thing. Life is always more complex than we think it is.
What do you think we need the most? Better prevention, treatments, or information?
I love the list that you outlined. So the challenges for the chlamydia field are almost all three of those. Prevention is critical. Most STIs are best controlled with prevention, and the best prevention would be a vaccine. Chlamydia is very hard to make a vaccine against, but I have no doubt that will happen eventually. Treatment is absolutely a critical aspect of chlamydia control, and I think we could do that better, and that's part of our research, is improving the options for treatment. But information really matters. There's a real stigma around STIs in lots of populations. There's a real stigma around infertility that might be because you had an STI years ago. And so I think changing our culture around acceptability of sexually transmitted infection, but just sexual behaviour in general, and just more acceptability, more ease of communication, so that there's not so much of a stigma for those women who are infertile and worried that, that maybe that's why, and they can't even talk about it. So I think all three, prevention, treatment, but also change that stigma and open the conversation. Maybe more people will get tested and treated as well.
How difficult is to speak about STI, sexually transmitted infections?
There's been lots of work in many countries around, for women, for example, when they come in for their cervical screening, to try and get a routine sexual health workup without a stigma. Just, you're already here, let's do that. But that's often only every 2 years, and now that will decrease with the change in cervical screening to PCR. There's been lots of conversations around trying to target risk groups and have a broader conversation around healthy sexual behaviour, and acceptability. But most GPs find it really challenging to have that conversation, or they're just too busy. So there's lots of activities around a clinic nurse, perhaps, around targeted screening and outreach in jails, high schools, nightclubs, to try and reach the most vulnerable people and screen them more regularly. So lots of go to them. There was a study done by researchers in Australia about a postal pee and post, where they used a special material to dry the pee so they could post it and do a PCR test and then post them the antibiotics later. So there's lots of research being done in acceptability of seeking testing and treatment, but I think we've got a long way to go. Having said that, when we talk to our university students about our research, and we run a free sexual health clinic with the doctors, not with our researchers, in the campus, the doctors say that lots of young people on university campuses will openly say, I'm here for my sexual health checkup. So maybe we're getting there with some populations.
Why did you decide to research this topic? Is it personal?
I'm really passionate about women's health. I think that women's health, and particularly the kind of, the vagina and the reproductive tract, are neglected. I think we need to pay them some more attention. And so, I think people feel uncomfortable about, honest conversations about sex and about reproductive health, particularly for women. And therefore, we don't know as much. And I think we need to change that, and we need to change the conversations and our comfort levels around talking about our vaginas and our cervix and our own health. It's deeply important to us. At some point, to many of us, not to all of us, but at some point, many of us will deeply care that we would get to reproduce, or that we get to be involved in parenthood. And so fertility is a really personal issue. It really matters to me that our research can actually make a difference to individuals. That's something that's so fundamental to many people that it's really confronting when they find out they're infertile or they need fertility treatment. We spend a lot of our lives trying to control for pregnancy and plan for pregnancy and prevent pregnancy until we're ready. And then it's really shocking to some women to find out that they're not fertile or they're going to need treatment to achieve their pregnancies. And so it is personal. Yeah, it's personal. It's something I'm passionate about. And I think as a mum, and also I had fertility treatment for my children. My cause of infertility is still not really clear. And just as a woman, I think that all of those things matter. And research is something that I really need to care about, and I do care about it a lot, and that's why I do it.
How important is it, in your opinion, to have a conversation about women's body?
I think it's critically important that we start having open and frank conversations with men and women that we bleed every month. We have pain every month. Some women have very serious pain every month. We go through a normal biological process where our body changes throughout that month. And that's all normal, and we quietly hide it. Why? It should be celebrated. Can you imagine if men had periods? They would be derived through tampon vending machines. They would be at the bar. You could order your gin and tonic and your tampons. So, I just think it's a symptom of a patriarchal society that all of a sudden, menstrual blood is icky, and that, we don't talk about periods, and we don't admit that we're having a bad day because we've got period pain, but it's quite fine to say we're having a bad day because we have a headache. I think it's really important, and I think by keeping it sort of a secret thing that we can't talk about, we're giving some kind of message to our young women that that's kind of wrong, but it's not wrong. It's biology. Half the population goes through it. So for me, it's really, I could go on about it for ages. I think it's really important that we change the conversation, and we're enabling a better attitude to our health, but I think we're also enabling a better attitude to women as functional, important members of society who just have different biology.
Equality between men and women should not mean that women should become like men, right?
Absolutely. If we think as a society we can achieve equality by fixing the women and making them more like men and fit in the patriarchal constructs that we've made, we're not going to benefit from that. The women will be less happy than they already are, and we're not actually gaining the biological and the wonderful differences that we give won't be gained because they'll be trying to hide them in pretending to be like men. So no, I completely agree. Yeah, I think we need to really push some pretty uncomfortable and hard barriers around women are different, and it's really great. And, period blood, it's everywhere. We all have periods. It's fine. It's actually fine. Look at us. We're here. It's not the scary thing that you think it might be.
You are interested also in equality in your team. Could you tell me more about this?
Absolutely. So in my work, I'm very conscious of those, that the gender differences, equity and diversity in my sector has a long way to go. Diversity as well as equity. So, the classic white male, or the classic, even stereotypically maths or computational science, maybe even an Asian male is viewed as being smarter or whatever. There's all these horrible stereotypes. So in our team, we talk a lot about that. We talk a lot about the fact that our cohorts of participants need to include diverse participants, Indigenous participants, people who identify in the LGBTIQ spectrum. Their needs need to be represented. And in our own team, we're open about people who have different identities, whether that's with respect to their identity or their heritage, ethnic heritage. And we're lucky, in fact, that we have a very diverse team of researchers, and all those voices in the room creates an amazing, challenging atmosphere. But also it brings us all so much further forward. We also have a lot of activities in my faculty around championing that diversity. And so in my other role within my faculty, I'm chair of our Equity and Diversity Committee. And so we're constantly calling out for new behaviours and new activities and new ways to change our culture in our sector to support a broader inclusivity within our sector of these different groups. And, women, but not just women. And not just white women. It has to be an intersectional approach.
You are really passionate about outreach. Why does outreach matter?
So I think outreach is a way of giving back to the community. I'm in a position of privilege. I have a permanent university job. I get to do research. I get to teach undergraduates and postgraduates. I outreach by going into high schools. I outreach by social media and communication. I contribute wherever I can to internet forums or, profiles on internet, things like this, because I feel I think the broad exposure of research matters. The community needs to know what research dollars are being spent on in a way that they can understand it so that they see the value of research. So that's one reason for doing it. But one of my really main reasons for doing it is if you can't see role models ahead of you doing things that you think are interesting, then how do you know to go into that field? And so I think for young women and girls going through high school, if all they see in the media, which largely they do, is men with beards in lab coats, then science doesn't seem like they belong. And so if we're not out there pushing ourselves out there, how do they know that they belong in science? And so for me, that's why outreach matters.
Where do you see your research in 10 years?
I think I see my research becoming much more holistic and much more engaged with women and looking really at chlamydia and other infectious agents still in the reproductive space, but really a whole approach at the whole package, social factors, their immune response, their body, maybe their genetics, and how all of those interplay in some women to have the consequences of infertility, and how we can work with the whole woman better earlier to understand her risks and work with her to help prevent her risks of becoming infertile later, or knowing that she's at greater risk and she can consider how to protect herself.
Is there one thing that people should know more about chlamydia?
I guess the one thing that I want people to know is that it's not their fault. Even if they're positive, it's not their fault. It's okay. Come back for more testing and treating. Don't hide away if you think you're at risk. It's not your fault. It's okay to have an STI. It's just better if we can treat you more quickly and, prevent it from spreading further, but also maybe prevent the disease from getting worse for you.
Is there a key message that you would like to tell to your children?
Don't forget who you are. There's so much in society that tells you who you should be. Who you are and what your core values are, just hang on to those and stick to those and do what you want to do that you feel is the best and the right thing for everyone around you, but take who you are into that.
Thank you so much, Willa, for this conversation.
No problem. Thank you. I hope that helped.
And thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye. Ciao.